Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sally Jerepatritis. I'm the Secretary of the City of Canada Bay Heritage Society. It's not working?
Yes.
It's not, yeah, I think it is. Can you turn it up out the, you know how you can turn it up, John? Yeah. Okay. We can turn it up a bit more as well. Yeah. So my name's Sally Jerepatritis. I'm the Secretary of the City of Canada Bay Heritage Society, and I'd just like to welcome you all here today. We're really excited we normally have our guest speakers on the first Saturday of the month, so for all our regulars this is really special to have two this month. And I've only met Clare in person since this last visit, but Clare and I have been talking over the phone about her book and coming here and giving a talk. So, but before I start, given we are a history museum, I'd just firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wongal clan, who are one of the 29 tribes of the Great Eora Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their continuing tradition of the land, the water and sky in this area. But today we're going to learn about Nell Fraser. I'm going to say nothing else other than to say I'm really excited that Clare's here. It's really special. I mean, I know that Clare did grow up in the area and I know little bits about her, but obviously there's a lot of family here who know a lot more than me. So I'm really excited that you're all here welcoming Clare back to Concord and the great work that she does for us at the museum. And so I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, I'm delighted to see everybody. I too would like to acknowledge the Wongal group who've cared for this land that I care about for so much, and they've cared for it before Europeans even knew there was such a place as Concord. And I think, having grown up here, we can only treasure the care that they exercised over the land and the waters around Concord, so that we could live in such a beautiful place. Let me begin by saying that some of you may have noticed there is a book for sale about Eleanor Fraser, and it's for sale here. You can get a copy afterwards. I'd be happy to sign as many copies as you might buy. The record, I believe, is 9. So I'm going to talk about Eleanor Register, who was a countrywoman, alas, from...
Just before, I just wanted to say this is being recorded. Just so you know, it's being recorded, so if you don't want your face in, just keep looking to the front because the camera's at the back. Everyone okay with that? Sorry, I just didn't seek permission, so I'm sorry.
That's all right. One of the things about giving this talk, which has been really excited, is that it's being recorded, so many more members of the family can get to see the talk. So just as curiosity, how many family members are here? Can you raise your hands? Oh, lovely. I've traced about 15,000 descendants from Eleanor Register, so there's a good few of us around. There are even family members living in Concord, living now on land that was granted to Eleanor Fraser. So we're kind of immobile in one way and very mobile in another, in that I live for my sins in the United States of America. So if you don't get your copy of the book today, you'll always be able to order a copy from the museum. So let me get started. And I want to ask you, how do you imagine your forebears? Some of us think of them kind of like this. See if I can make it work. Thank you.
I don't imagine.
Isn't she sweet? Isn't the little baby adorable? We might also think of them like this. Here he is. This is a little boy. He's all dressed up in his military cap, and his mum adores him, right? So when we think of our ancestors in Australia, we can put this same kind of view into a colonial New South Wales picture. And here they are, happy, well-fed families, enjoying their lives in their new land. Australian convicts. They weren't well fed, they weren't well housed, and they probably weren't very happy. To get a more realistic image of what the colonial Eleanor Fraser might have looked like, we can look at something like this. Here she is. She's not happy. Her little boy, John, is kind of thin, and the newborn baby, he's just there. And this is what her life was like in 1791. Her husband had just finished drinking himself to death, and there she was, stuck. Her housing was, well, let's just say, air-conditioned. Plenty of room for the air to move through. Life was a struggle for these people. It was really tough in the lean years. The lean years when, but for the foresight of Arthur Phillip, everybody would have starved. People actually died of malnutrition and starvation in colonial New South Wales. He sent ships to the Cape for extra food. He sent ships to Batavia for extra food, and that was what got them through. What I'm trying to do today is not give you an ideal picture, but talk about what it was really like, so we can get an idea of what they went through and how accomplished the people were who did well in these circumstances. Now, I'd like to talk, and Kate, could you do the handout, or Jen? I'm going to hand out some show and tell, because
There's enough for every two people.
Nell Fraser got to Australia with her husband, Bill, by robbing a wagon. This was not some starving lass who stole a loaf of bread to feed her hungry children. No. They stole a wagon. And the list of things that they stole were 6 pieces of fustian, a sheet of yellow canvas, and half a gross of filleting. Now, let me do a little show and tell. As you can see in the picture, this is a factory of the time in England. You can see that all the raw materials for this factory, they're arriving and they're leaving by wagon. And that made them really, really vulnerable to theft. What I think happened is these two robbed the wagon and the goodies turned up in their lodgings. Let me tell you about the fabric they stole. This stringy substance is the thread that was woven into the fustian fabric. It's a tough yarn. It's a bit like thin string. If you take up these 2 pieces of fabric, the buff one and the blue one, this is what fustian is. The blue one is a kind of softer version. The buff one is really, really tough. These were not fine fabrics. They were made for working men and women. And they were usually made into clothing. On the
I'm just going to have to talk to the people online for a minute. Those people who are listening online, could you please put your microphones on mute, please?
The picture on the left is a dress made out of this kind of softer version. And it's trimmed with yellow canvas. This yellow canvas, as you can tell, is a much finer yarn. And here it's being used as trim. So this is a working woman's dress. She's got a chemise on underneath, and it's trimmed in this yellow canvas. Now, how do you get the dress to hang correctly? Perhaps none of you guys know this, but one of the ways to do that is as your dress is being hemmed, you put some fabric in the hem and hem it up, and that stiffens the hem. When you didn't have interfacing, or fusible interfacing, remember that? You use this stuff to stiffen the hem so you can sew correctly. It sticks out a little bit and makes the dress look good. So these two examples of the uses of the fabric were what most of the stuff was used for. Now, this stuff would be used for men's overalls, men's working jackets. This is pretty indestructible stuff. One of the nice things I like about this is it's so versatile. You can make bales out of this. You can make curtains out of this. You can wax this, throw it over a load on a wagon, and you have a waterproof covering. So let me notice something here. The list that I've given you here, here is actually in order of value. Fabric was least expensive. The canvas, because it's very finely woven, is the next most valuable. One sheet of this is worth 6 pieces of this. But then, most expensive thing was the half a gross of filleting, which is what this was called. Half a gross is 72 rolls. Now, when I bought these from historical reenactment people to get the right stuff, they come in 30 centimeter diameter rolls. They stole 72 of them. You've got to ask yourself, well, were they nuts? No, actually they weren't. This was a really, really canny theft. Because if you think about it, all of this stuff disappears. You give this to a dressmaker, it's a dress, it's trimming. The filleting's not even seen, it's in the hem. My theory is they robbed the wagon, their employers, Leith and Company, suspected them, found the stuff in their lodgings, and sent them to trial. No matter how good a thief you are, you have to be really good not to get caught. So they were tried at the January 1787 Lancaster Assizes. This is in fact a picture of Lancaster Assizes. It was a carnival. Think mixture, music festival, market, with a lot of alcohol. Everybody out here is having a great time. The judges arrive, they parade in their robes. It's great fun for everybody on the outside. People on the inside, not so much. It was very quick. Average trial at the time, about 3-4 minutes. They read the charges. They say to the complainant, "Is this your stuff?" He says, "Yes." Guilty, death. Except it wasn't quite the same at the time. The call had already gone out for suitable people to go to Australia. And so Nell Fraser and Bill Fraser probably knew they were not going to die, that they would be transported. And they were even more confident because the same company had been robbed by another of their employees, and he had just been sentenced to transportation. So this company is responsible for 3 first fleeters. Not a bad accomplishment. So they sailed on the Charlotte in May. They arrived in Botany Bay in 1788. In just 1 calendar year, their lives had completely been transformed. They went from working in Manchester to Botany Bay, and soon that led to the camp. In the first years, you can see in the right-hand side map, this is the map showing where the ships were moored when the First Fleet first anchored at Circular Quay, as we now call it. At the very top, Sirius was anchored out in the harbour with its guns trained forward. Remember, the French came into Botany Bay at the time, and Arthur Phillip was very concerned that they might in fact want to establish their own colony in New South Wales, and so he was prepared with the guns on the Sirius. Very soon the observatory with gun emplacement was put in place to protect the harbour. One of the nice things about the cove is you have to sail towards the cove head on for about 45 minutes under the guns of whatever's at the end of the bay. So it was a relatively safe anchorage. Now, Arthur Phillip had ideas. He decided that, well, we all know that the British have a fondness for class relationships. So he decided that on the eastern side of the cove would be his house, and the judge and the parson and the administrators, the good convicts, the well-behaved convicts, and, well, for the rest, there was the west, separated by the tank stream to keep the two apart. So one of the most interesting things was the placement of the blacksmiths. And so now let me show you where it was. Right down here, within sight of Government House. The blacksmiths was unloaded and was the first functional building in the bay. Why? Because they needed the products from that blacksmith for tools, for sharpening axes, for just about anything involved in establishing the camp. As you can see from the left-hand side, the blacksmith was close to the wharf, close to the marine guard, close to the tank stream. This meant actually that Nell Fraser and Bill Fraser were witnesses to the very early happenings in Sydney. For instance, when Arthur Phillip decided he was going to kidnap Aboriginal men to try and make peace with them in a rather misguided effort, they came ashore and basically walked past the blacksmith's house on their way up to Government House. When Phillip was wounded at Manly and was brought ashore and everyone was sure he was going to die, there's blood everywhere, it came right past their house. But I'm not going to dwell so much on those historic events. You can read in the book. In the first 2 years, Nell Fraser and Bill Fraser basically had 2 children. Meanwhile, Bill Fraser was drinking himself to death, and he died in June of 1791. When he died in June of 1791, Nell Fraser was left with a toddler of 2 and a babe in arms. But she wasn't alone for long. You can see on the left here her little family tree. William Fraser's now dead. It's just Nell Fraser and the 2 boys. Within about 5 months, she had established a new relationship with William Morgan. William Morgan arrived on the Neptune as a member of the New South Wales Corps with his wife, Mary Jones Morgan. Now the sequence here is not quite a family tree, but you'll see why. Molly Morgan and William Morgan were married. They also stole yarn, hempen yarn. It would seem that the family has a fondness for very tough, very strong yarn. Almost exactly the same as the Frasers stole. So she gets caught, well they both get caught. He escapes to Wales. She gets caught, gets convicted, sentenced to transportation. He's in Wales. He may still be in love with the woman because he joins the New South Wales Corps. And 21 days later, he's being loaded onto the Neptune, the same ship she's on. That's probably where the romance started to decline just slightly. Because he had been in the army for such a short period of time, he actually probably had never fired a gun. He didn't have any of the basic training because all they did was they signed him up, they marched him to the port, and they put him on a boat. But because he was a wheelwright, he was probably literate, and that made him a good candidate to be a valet or a personal servant to one of the officers. And that officer was Captain Nicholas Nepean, captain of the New South Wales Corps. And hence Molly Morgan got to know Captain Nepean and became his mistress. Oh yeah. So when they arrive in Australia, we've got Nick, Captain Nick, as his men called him, behind his back I'm sure, and Molly Morgan are an item. And William Morgan is sort of extra. He takes up with Nell Fraser. And because Bill Morgan is free, she can sort of be his hut keeper, shall we call it, his housekeeper. And they live in Sydney for about 2 years. But then they're both coming to their end of their government service. Bill Morgan has signed up for a period of years, and he's going to be done in 1794. Nell Fraser has been sentenced to 7 years transportation. Her sentence is up in January 1794. Now they have a choice. They could go back to some other British colony. Many people left the colony when their sentences were all over. You could go to India, you could go to the Americas. You just couldn't go back to Britain. And so when they considered what they were going to do, they decided to stay. Why? Because, well, they already, Nell Fraser had a couple of kids, they were making a life there. She didn't have much contact or much reason to go back to Britain. And as ex-convicts and ex-military people, you could get grants of land. You could end up owning more land in Australia than you could ever dream of owning in England. So Francis Gross, by this time, had taken over from Arthur Phillip. He wanted to centre people in Ryde and Concord. If you think of it, you've got Sydney, you've got Ryde, Concord, you've got Parramatta. And he's thinking like a military man. He's got two militarized areas. If he puts another pairing in the middle, that strengthens the whole colony. They probably went to Concord first in the spring of 1793 to look at the land and peg out the land that they wanted. This was usually done by ring-barking trees or blazing them. That meant that would come February of 1794, the grant was issued to Nell Fraser for 20 acres. As you can see, I'm going to wander a bit. The 2 grants, Bill Morgan and Nell are next to each other on the eastern side of Concord Road. And interestingly enough, they're very close to people that they already knew in the military. So they're not moving to a place of strangers, but rather a place that they knew people. One of the things that we know about Eleanor is that she was the first woman, the first European woman to own land in her own name in Concord, and hence in New South Wales and Australia. Why? Why would you give land to a woman? Well, because she wasn't married. Bill Morgan, remember, had a wife. She was living in Parramatta with Captain Nick. So it wasn't like you could pretend they were a couple. So he got 25 acres, she got 20 acres. But let's, again, keep with our theme of what was it really like. As I said, they went there for the first time in spring of 1793. So let's go to Concord in 1793. It's spring, it's about now. They're going out to look at the land. What did they see? This is a photograph of Concord taken by me in 1990. This is a remnant turpentine woodland. You can see the grass has been burnt to keep it open. Not much bush. Not a bad area, right? But a lot of the land was like this. Really scraggly, mixed variety bushland. But even in the back of this photo, you can see there's a huge tree. So what we've got is sort of an area that can be cleared a bit, but there are trees and big trees. And remember, we're talking about spring. So in spring, we get the blossoming of the bush. So this is what they saw. Some open land, some denser vegetated land, and flowers. So what was it like then to actually try and farm this land? The first Concord harvests were achieved by hand. And when I say hand, I mean by hand. The first illustration on the left shows a guy. He's tilling this land with a hoe by hand. The trees have been ring-barked, and they were ring-barked so you got more sun coming in, more light getting to the ground. The trees would come back down later, but the first thing was get the sunshine on the crop. The land hadn't been farmed by European methods before, and so they ring-barked trees, they sowed by hand, they cultivated and weeded by hand, they harvested by hand using hand sickles, and they threshed the grain by hand. So this was an extremely labor-intensive activity, and it's one of the reasons that when grants were given out, people were assigned a couple of convicts to help with the very heavy labor. But once you started to get more open spaces, you could begin to think of plowing the land. There was a couple of barriers there, however. Plowing the land meant you needed to plow, but we're good with that because Bill Morgan is a wheelwright. He's got those skills. The only thing you don't have are horses and bullocks. So what you do is you get the convicts, you hitch them up, and that's how you plow your first year. But there's a tremendous advantage in doing that. You can sow more accurately. You can plow a bigger area. You can have a much larger area under cultivation. Sure, you've got the stumps still to avoid, but you've got a much greater area sown. Again, harvesting is by hand, but as you can see in the right-hand picture, this lady has been using a hand sickle, but the man on the other side has made the transition to a scythe. So he can take down a whole bundle of wheat at the same time. There was, of course, the decline in fertility of the land, because this land not only had not been farmed in a European sense before, there was no way to fertilize it. There was no animal dung. There were no chemicals. So the land quickly lost its fertility. And so the farms had to be quite diverse. We know what the Morgan farm produced. It grew wheat. Wheat was the main cash crop. Maize, again, only the very elite ate wheaten bread every day. Most people ate cornbread, sometimes with some wheat mixed in. The barley was grown not only for food for humans, like gruel, Scotch broth, and barley malt, of course, but these in combination would sustain the family along with their livestock, the chickens, the pigs, the geese, the goats, and most important, the orchard. The first thing planted in your orchard are your peaches. Why? Plant a peach tree, it grows fast, you may even get fruit bearing that first year. Besides which, the sugar content is very high and it's very good for fermenting all kinds of things. You follow with apples, pears, oranges, grapes. And of course, given the amount of wood that they're clearing, the wood is used domestically for structures, for a house, for a hut, but also is sold for fuel and as sawn timber. And a lot of the wood cleared from Concord went by boat to Sydney to build Sydney. And this was true for Ryde as well. They made their own bread on the farm. They distilled their own salt. They made their own soap. The fact that the farms were this diverse meant that there was always something to do. There was always some job that needed the owner or the convicts or the children. Let me pause for a minute and say, what did Concord look like by the 1790s? Most of the land has been given out to ex-convicts, to ex-military. The fertility has been declining, so people are moving to sheep, to cattle. In fact, the transition was so important, the government even loaned cattle to people. They would say to a farmer, I'll give you a pregnant cow, you get to keep the calf, give the cow back. And so in this way, they were trying to get people to move to sustainable farms. A lot of people only lasted 3-4 years as farmers because a lot of people didn't have the skills. One of the big advantages Nell Fraser had was she was from the country. She knew how to do these jobs. As this was happening, they faced the monopolies of the New South Wales Court. And so people were quite poor. They were going into debt and petty crime was rising. Now, for those of you who've read about the early settlement in Sydney, you'll know there was a system of night watchmen established to police the community. The same thing was adopted in other places. The system spread from Sydney to Parramatta to the roads to try and deal with the people who'd gone bush, who would later be called bushrangers. And those constables were usually chosen by the local administrator or in country areas by the local people themselves. So in 1798, the inhabitants were asked to choose a constable. This was not one man, one vote. No, no, no. Remember Arthur Phillip's division, good people to the east, the rest, the west. Okay, inhabitants had a meaning. They were people with property, people who had a stake in the community. You convicts didn't get to vote. Your labourers didn't get to vote. You had to be somebody. So the inhabitants of Concord got together and chose a constable. But something was wrong. They got the wrong result. We don't know if Nell Fraser was particularly outspoken. We don't know if she supported the wrong candidate. But somebody thought, aha, I have a way of challenging this, and filed a complaint with the judge advocate and said, there were ladies who voted. And so they were presented with this real problem because the government wanted, the administration wanted to have the inhabitants vote, but they needed to exclude this class of people who were disturbing the balance of what they thought the right outcome would be. It's like we have this rule, but when we apply it, we get the wrong results. So can we tweak it somehow so we get the right result? And what they did, they gave their opinion that their voice is prohibited from an incompetency. Yeah, nonetheless, in 1798, a woman voted in Concord. We know who she was. The next woman to vote in Concord, in New South Wales, in Australia, was in 1903 in the federal election, 106 years later. I think it's very interesting that we can claim the first person, the first woman to vote was in Concord. Now let me tell you a bit more about Concord as it develops. And for those of you in the family, you probably know the diagram up the top. This is Eleanor with her partner, Bill Morgan, and this is her grants in Concord. As time went by, the initial housing wore out very quickly because it wasn't very good, and you got a second generation of housing very much like this one here. You'll notice that this one, which is a actual picture of a slab hut in New South Wales, which I have digitally altered, not AI, digital. But it reflects a real step up in technology. It's got sawn boards. It's got bracing above the windows. Those windows have shutters. There's a door that closes. A roof that is made out of wood, secured down. This bark and wood roof is probably waterproof. This was the state of technology around 1800 in country New South Wales. As you can see though, the state of the housing was not what we would think of as deluxe, but it was great for them. And it was great for the Morgan Fraser family. And things certainly were going fine, except about 1798, the relationship between Bill Morgan and Nell Fraser broke down. And Nell then did something remarkable. She became the first person from Concord, and I haven't proved it yet, but I think the first person in New South Wales to sue her spouse. Yeah, I was taken aback too. You can see that the Morgan farm here, the two properties together, they're next to each other, and they obviously were farming as a farm, but when they split, apparently Bill Morgan thought he should get the goodies, which he would have been entitled to had they been married, but they weren't married. So she sued him for the return of her sow and her 8 piglets and her seed wheat. She walked into Sydney, took out a subpoena against him, made him show up the next week, and the judge told him, you got to give the pigs back, you got to give the sow back, and you got to give the seed corn back. This to me was pretty stunning. You know, it's obvious that she was probably a little upset, you know, reading between the lines there, but she needed those piglets. Each piglet was worth 5 shillings. That's about what you paid a labourer for a week's work. So her 8 piglets is 2 months' work. And if she's losing her farming partner in Bill Morgan, she needs all the assets she can get. So she went to court and got them. So another of the things while I'm here, I want to point out to you is, can you see the grant to Isaac Nichols?
Yes.
About this time, when Isaac got his first grant up here, he bought the second one and hence became a neighbour of the Morgans. He now got another big grant here. And so the families got to know each other, and they were very close. As we'll see later, very close indeed. Oh my. Things went on quite normally. Isaac Nichols is investing in his country property. A lot of his workers actually live with the Frasers and the Morgans. Things seemed to be just fine until 1805, when the family collapsed. Bill Morgan left the family and moved into Sydney. And you can see here on the left-hand side, he sets up his wheelwright business in what was then Chapel Row. It's now Castlereagh Street. He lived there for a year, then he decamped to Windsor with his new partner and lived in Windsor until she died. And then he moved to Liverpool to live with his oldest daughter, where he died in 1828. I'm skimming some things, obviously, but we need to get through everything. About the same time then, Nell Fraser is left in Concord. She's already bought Bill Morgan's 25 acres. So she combines them together and she sells them to Isaac Nichols, who needs grazing land because he's using his property to graze cattle and sheep. She moves north along Parramatta Road. If you're driving on Parramatta Road and you get to the drive, which runs off to the right-hand side as you're going north, which was the drive to Uralla, the Morgan property starts on your left at about that point, runs from Concord Road to Homebush Bay and north. She bought that from the estate of a deceased convict. Very adventurous. She's moving within Concord. She's moving with a new partner, Thomas Humphreys. She's pregnant with her final son, Richard. And then in July 1806, her son Daniel is out on Homebush Bay in a canoe with another guy. The canoe capsizes and he drowns. This is another Nell first for Concord. Her son became the first European to drown in Homebush Bay. Very sad. But did she give up? No way. The next 10 years were basically spent raising the family in Concord. I put the details up here, but it was a normal family. The kids grew up. The oldest boy got married, it failed. He got over it, he formed another relationship, he went on. Anne Morgan married William Milson and moved to his farm, which of course was the Frederick Meredith grant at Rhodes Point. Only later would it be sold to Thomas Walker and become Rhodes Point. Didn't have a name before then. I tried everything to find out what that name of that points was, but there isn't a name. Lucy Morgan, another one, married and lived with her convict husband. So the family is just, it's a normal family growing up. When we get to the 20s, things get a little hairy for Eleanor. She's got, her oldest boy dies tragically. One of her daughters is murdered, okay? And to cap it all off, in 1828, her youngest boy is accused of rape. So the 20s were not exactly a peak experience. And by then, she's getting old. You know, she moved in 1827 to live with the son of Isaac Nichols. Isaac Nichols had three sons. One of whom, the middle one, became the first barrister and solicitor in New South Wales. He was the first native-born barrister. He was also a member of the first Legislative Council. In other words, he was a notable person, and why on earth would our ancestor be living with such a notable person? Because they grew up with them. They were living on the Nichols estate right next to the Morgans. She'd known that child his whole life. And so she moved in. She probably helped care for his daughter because the mother had died. So here she is. She's living with the Nichols boy, but not at what we know as Uralla, rather closer to Parramatta Road. He built a house there so he could easily get into Sydney to the law courts. And he bought up the properties around it to make another estate. So when, in 1840, the Uralla estate was mortgaged to Thomas Walker, Obby Nichols didn't really care, because he now lived here. And with him lived Nell Fraser. Now you would think that she's getting old. She made her will in 1833. It seemed like when she turned 70 in 1834, she's going to drift into a nice, relaxed retirement. Oh, but as my mother used to say, quoting Dylan Thomas, rage, rage against the fading of the light. And that's what she did. In 1835, Nell Fraser, as an old woman, filed suit to regain a 60-acre grant of land that had been made to her oldest son, John Fraser. She said it was made to him in 1823. He died in 1823, so he couldn't develop it. I'm a little old lady. I need that land. And she got it. The interesting thing was then that that meant that when she died in 1840, her interest in that land had been established, which meant that her grandson, John Fraser, when he came of age, he could petition for the land, and he got it. And he used that money to finance their branch of the family's decampment to the goldfields of Victoria. So, but for her feistiness, they would not have been able to go on their Victorian adventure. So as I say, a very, very exciting life. She lived from 1764 to 1840, but how should we remember her? Should we remember her as a worn-out old woman with hands gnarled and twisted with arthritis from a lifetime spent in hard physical labor? Or was she an old woman who had hardships and challenges? She'd had losses. Some things had gone her way. Her determination and energy to fight seemed to last her entire life. I even think perhaps she was happy with her life. She was satisfied with what she had achieved. And so maybe we could remember her like this. So, in conclusion, I think we can agree that she made history in Concord, and she was an exemplary Concordian. And I can take questions if anyone has any.
Claire, the second husband, the last one, seemed to be 20 years younger than she was.
Oh, you did notice that?
I think that's a bit unusual even today.
No, it wasn't that, bizarrely enough, that wasn't that unusual. One of the things that was going on at the time, and we actually have another case in the family. You remember I mentioned Molly Morgan? She married a man who was 30 years younger than her. Okay. There were so few women that any woman could probably get a husband if they wished. Okay? Well, yeah, and as John said, she's quite attractive. She's a go-getter. Yes. One thing I did want to mention was that in proving that Richard Fraser Morgan was in fact fathered by Thomas Humphreys, I have to give credit to the people who really, really helped me do that, and that's the people at the New South Wales Archives. They must have copied half a dozen documents so I could triangulate in them. So whatever you're paying in taxes, that fraction of a penny that goes to the archive is worth it. Other questions? Yes.
I noticed on one of the slides that by the second generation, John and Daniel, you'd added the I, Frazier. And I know one of the birth certificates I've got for the next John, he's spelt with an I, but so it sort of comes and goes, the I, does it?
And another good example of the same thing is Eleanor Redchester. Her father's name was spelt Richard Register. And this is because the person making the record, the minister or the clerk, is listening to people who have accents that are different than theirs. So Fraser. Yeah, so people are writing what they're hearing. It's not that the people are necessarily changing the spelling, it's the person recording is hearing something different. And a lot of people's spellings really didn't stabilize till around 1900 even. You know, I've got a family named Burke, 3 different Burkes in the 1890s. And they all knew each other, which is bizarre. Yes?
I think it's interesting that all of her children have Fraser as a middle name, even the Morgan children.
One of the ways that this happened was they weren't married.
No.
So very often the parish register will say, Richard, son of Eleanor Fraser, and, you know, so they put the mother's whole name in there. Whereas if they'd been married, they would have said, Frances, daughter of Anne and Thomas, what's your name? So that because they weren't married, it gets injected in there. The girls don't tend to use it, the boys do. It's really, really very interesting.
I think I read somewhere that there was a question about before they were transported that Bill Fraser and Eleanor may have had a child already.
They got married very special place, which I haven't talked about. Believe me, my family will tell you I can do this, talking about the family. I'm looking at my sister for hours and hours and hours. This village was very special. But yes, when they got married, they lived there for at least a year. They had a son, and we don't know what happened to him. He didn't die in that village. About 18 months after they married, they moved to Manchester. Who knows what happened to that child? My theory is he probably died, given the area in Manchester in which they lived. This area was awful. In fact, Engels uses it as a description of the worst slums of capitalism. I mean, it was grim. It was really, really bad and very polluted. He could easily have died of typhoid or what have you. And in fact, when they were in prison, there's a wonderful letter from the jailer at Lancaster Castle that I showed you in the where the assizes were held. He wrote to Evan Nepean and said, I have this couple here. They don't have their marriage certificate. They've been married. They've had children. Could they go on the same ship? And this is how I think they ended up on the same ship. So I think that, and I've reproduced in the book his letter because it's so touching that a man who was basically a person who organized the conviction and housing of convicts would go out of his way to help these young people. Because they were pretty young when they were shipped. Yeah.
I'd like to know much more about the excursion to the goldfields. How many more books are you going to write? I have to wait to find out about that.
Not too long. On my laptop that I brought with me is the draft of the next 2 books. One is all the children of Granny Ellen, excuse me, that's how I think of her. So John, Daniel, William, Richard, Anne, Lucy, Sarah. I have drafted that book and that's sort of ready to go into editing now. The other book that's in draft is a book about Molly Morgan, the wife of Bill Morgan. Oh yeah, so when you say, ooh, you're so right. You know, she is a spicy person. And,
I'm just showing the people online.
So those 2 are in draft, and in fact, the way I'm setting up the notes now is the next books are writing themselves as I do the research, so not long.
Great, and then,
You're welcome.
Anyone online got questions? You can turn your mics on now. Oh, Martin, you've got, Marie, you've got your hand up, you need to do it yourself, you need to turn your mic on. Okay, go Marie.
Has that worked?
That's it, we can hear you.
Great. First of all, apologies because I referred earlier. I was trying to figure out all the how to log on properly. So apologies, everybody.
No problem.
Secondly, thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. I can't believe you've done so much research. Good on you. Ellie. Good on you all. Thank you. I had a question. Do you know anything about the land wars between the Morgan and the Walker? Because my mum told me that there was still Aboriginals on the land and that they got poisoned at the land wars.
Okay, let me tell you what I know. The Indigenous population in Concord were present throughout the early period of European settlement. We know that there was a raid on Isaac Nichols' property, and it basically these were raids as payback. There was that raid on Isaac Nichols' property. We don't know why. There was another raid on Edward Powell's halfway house on Parramatta Road, and we do know why that happened. And he thoroughly deserved it. In that case, the Indigenous people came, they took something like 45 sheep from him. In the Concord case, the raid on the Nichols property, there were a couple of guys out minding his cattle, I think. They descended on their hut and said, "Give us your stuff." They took some things. The European guys fled back to the Frasers, actually, and they didn't take anything beyond. Someone said they took trinkets. God knows what that means, you know. But I think the persistence of the Indigenous people here has been remarkable. I can remember when, let's see, in the early 1960s, being taken down to Homebush Bay to see the fish trap, which was a series of holes that had been dug in the foreshore rocks. So when the water came in, they filled up. And then as the tide went out, these pools would be left. So there could have been fish trapped in them. So it was a passive fishing system. And I think that we should not shy away from the fact that our ancestors, for those of you who are descended, they were taking somebody else's property. You know, they came, they were brought to help establish a colony. You know, they were the labor force that was going to do the work of establishing this outpost of the British Empire. But nonetheless, when I say Nell received a grant, Francis Gross had no entitlement to give that land away. It wasn't his. It wasn't his under Aboriginal law or under British law at the time. You know, the King had given Arthur Phillip specific instructions to live in amity with the local inhabitants. Didn't stop him a bit. You know, they came, they said, "We're more powerful, we're stronger, we're better, and we're going to take the land regardless of what you say." And they did. And whenever there was a protest, the response was always disproportionately high. There was an incident with Fred Meredith, for instance. Some people here also descended from him, where some Aboriginal people raided his farm, or a neighbour's farm, and he went to help. Well, of course they raided the farm. The people had been given grants at Saltpan Creek, which turned out to be a prime yam growing area. It's not like someone gave away their best cropland. Of course they protested. So, you know, I do think that we shouldn't trivialize that amount of conflict. I don't think there are many reported cases in Concord, but I think that there had to be opposition.
Just chronologically, the chronology of Nell meant that when she landed in Sydney, she was 16 years old. Have I got that correct? She was born in 1764. 1788, she would have been 24.
I was going, no, that's wrong, but my mind is fried enough that I can't do the math. And I used to teach statistics at a university.
She
Yeah.
must have got married fairly young.
Yes, well, people did then.
He was 21, wasn't he? And she was bigger.
Bill Fraser is a year older than Nell Fraser. Yeah. But he showed remarkable ability. He drank himself to death by his early 30s. You know, and became very friendly with Watkin Tench, and so we know far more about Bill Fraser than most convicts. And he was a crim. He was definitely a crim. He deserved his trip to Australia. Yes. Yes.
But they couldn't sort of find anything too much on that.
In the same quote, he said he'd been a coiner, a soldier, a conjurer. In other words, he was a ne'er-do-well who served in the army, probably in the American Revolution, as many of the military people had. And he probably got back to England after the American War of Independence ended, say 1784, 85, something like that, was unemployed and just wandered around and was a conjurer, maybe sleight of hand man. Yeah, not the kind of person you wanted your kids' party with. Yes, I have a theory about that. The person who did do it, Thomas Barrett, he was a ripper, and he earned his passage. For those of you who don't know, and I think the story might be in the book, they got to Rio, and back then what they called the bumboats would come to the ship, and people would show their wares. People threw down money, they threw up the goods or the fruit or whatever, and they discovered these counterfeit coins. And we know that Barrett was guilty. He was also the person who made the first medal made in Australia. He made the Charlotte medal. There's a photo of that in the book. And he got hung. And he was 19. You know, so he didn't have a long life. He was a bad one, but very interesting young man.
Another question?
I visited Ellen's grave in the old cemetery at Liverpool. I'm not quite sure where William Morgan is. Do you know if he's in the same cemetery?
He is buried there, yes.
He is?
Yes, his grave is not marked.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I was going row by row but couldn't find him.
No, you probably found gravestones for Anne Wilson and William Wilson. He was living with them when he died.
Okay.
And I think he's actually next to them.
Okay, right.
Yeah, but it's not marked, no.
Yeah, I thought it might not be.
Yeah.
Thank
He had a long and interesting life, did Bill Morgan, yeah. I think he actually loved Molly Morgan, which was a real tragedy for him.
Claire, so Ellen's first husband, you're saying that he was the criminal, he was the bad one. Is that what I'm getting?
My theory is that Bill Fraser was, yeah.
Okay, so, because Ellen got sent here because of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So can we say that Bill was probably pushed her along? Because I don't like the fact that Nell, our grandmother, was... I want to think that she was pushed along to do it and not, she just got caught up.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there was a statute at the time. Remember, at this time, women, when they married, were subsumed legally into their husband. Okay, so her property became his property, and his job was to look after and support her. But what happens when, let's say, the goods are found in your lodge, in wherever you're living? Okay, if your lodgings have the goods in it and you're both there, aren't you both guilty? Well, you can plead the statute that says, "Oh, weak and tragic woman, he made me do it." But you see, you're dealing with people who are not well educated. She did not plead the statute. She was tried as Ellen Register. She wasn't tried as Ellen Fraser. She was tried as a single woman. and therefore guilty. That she could have played the statute had she known, but she didn't. So if you want that image of Nell as the badly done by lady, by her rotter of a husband, possible.
I'm glad she come. But I want to think of her as a innocent.
I think less guilty, maybe?
Less guilty, but thank you for coming and starting us all off.
Exactly.
Any more questions?
Yes,
Oh, hi Martin, yes, go ahead.
Nell's youngest daughter. Oh, sorry, you're on that.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for all the effort. I'll definitely buy a number of copies of your book. Firstly, I'd just like to know, I wonder if Nell would be surprised that one of her relatives, indeed my son, is currently studying law at Exeter University in the United Kingdom, given her habit of litigation. She might find that interesting. But my question is, how much do we know about Morgan's service in the Concord?
A little bit. We know, we can construct some of it in terms of, we know the exact day he enlisted. We know the circumstances of how he enlisted, and by the book, it's in there. And I think that we know, obviously, the ship he came in. We know something about his life in early Sydney because there was a series of court cases that he was marginally involved in. Mostly it was Molly Morgan, but yes, he was involved in those. We also know as the different units were assigned to different places, we know when he was in Sydney, when he was in Parramatta, and so on. He's also mentioned in a couple of diaries as, for instance, it's thought that Bill Morgan and his legal wife, Molly Morgan, ran a store in Parramatta. Now you might say to yourself, let me see, we've got a convict lady who's the mistress of the captain, and we've got her husband who's a servant. Where are they getting this stuff to sell in this store? Well, Captain Nick, good old Captain Nick, owned the Core's vegetable garden, 17 acres of it. And he had unlimited convicts to work that garden. He also participated in the famous speculative voyages of the New South Wales Corps to the Cape of Good Hope. So that from those kind of references, we know a few things, like they were probably selling on stuff from Nicholas Nepean in Parramatta, and so we can place that in time and space. But so yeah, you can cobble together a sequence of events around Bill Morgan. I focus this talk on Granny Ellen because people want to know about her. But you can do the same thing for Bill Morgan and for Bill Fraser as well. And of course for Molly Morgan, which I will have to be editing severely because the first draft came out at 306 pages. She's a very busy lady.
Did you have a question?
Sorry. You know, her youngest daughter, Sarah Morgan, married Frederick
Yes.
Meredith Jr. Now, on the map, Frederick Meredith had 60 acres at Rhodes, but I believe he didn't like the land, and I don't think he ever lived there.
No.
Worked on it.
Frederick Morgan had the tip of the point there. Interesting, there's a very interesting story about that land in particular. The first free settlers were assigned land in Liberty Plains, and the land wasn't very good. And in compensation, I mean, they basically went to the government and said, we're badly done by. I think they used different words. He got got this grant of land. By then he was a baker in Sydney. The idea was he would hold this land for a certain number of years and then he could sell it. Because all you had to do in those years is to put a hut on it. So all he had to do was send out a couple of convicts to build a hut, maybe keep a sheep or two, and he's good. And then he could sell that land at a profit. What he did was he sold it to John Colthred, ex-Marine, who lived in Ryde, on the opposite side of the river. John Colthred moved across in about 1804. That land then, John Colthred then proceeded to die, which was very fortunate because his wife was already in a relationship with William Wilson. The land was inherited by Colthred's wife, Catherine. She and William Wilson had a group of children, and then she died. So Wilson, the husband gets the wife's land. He did. He ends up with this land up here. He then marries Anne Wilson, Nell Fraser's oldest girl. Yeah. So
it was a very small
comes from Meredith through William Wilson into our family. They establish an inn in Liverpool, and they've got an interest in another inn on the Liverpool Road where Sarah goes to help out her sister Lucy. And where is that inn? Why, it's on the land that has been granted to Frederick Meredith Jr.
Yeah.
Sarah meets Frederick Meredith Jr. and bingo, 11 children. But the Merediths, Frederick Meredith Jr. didn't live there. He lived in Liverpool. And we know where. Because the house that they lived in was rented to them by William Wilson. They're very tight communities.
Thank you.
I've often thought that where the grave is a long way away from Concord, really, in Liverpool. Is this what you're explaining now? Why John and then Nell were buried at Liverpool when they were both living at Concord when they died?
That's a really good question. Because when you think about it, at the time, let's say John, 1823, he drowns, okay? He drowns in Humbush Bay. The inquest is held on Parramatta Road at the halfway house. This is much too complicated. You'll never guess who was running the inn. The choices at that point are Parramatta, Sydney, or Liverpool.
They're the only three centres.
And, a lot of people say, oh, wouldn't they bury them on the farm? No. If you had to, yes, but the respectable thing was to be buried in a proper cemetery. And I think they went to Liverpool because most of the family lived there. They're going down to Liverpool after the inquest anyway. So that's where they went.
Any more questions? Wow, Claire. Okay, Martin, got you.
There's one big question coming to mind about his son, who was the first barrister, I believe you said, Claire. So was she in a relationship with him or just sort of sharing accommodation? Could you just explain a little bit more about that? And thank you.
Yes, it's very, very interesting because Isaac Nichols' main site of operations was, if you know Sydney and you know where Cadman's Cottage is, sort of underneath the Museum of Contemporary Art is where Isaac Nichols lived. He was the postmaster, he was the superintendent of convicts, he was a muckety-muck. He had these 3 boys. He wanted them to grow up in a better place than he. So I think a number of years was spent on the Concord farm. And incidentally, for those people who are Concordians, the name of Urala was very imaginatively first named by Isaac Nichols. Isaac Nichols was the kind of guy who, like at Hunters Hill, he had a farm and he named it Hunters Hill Farm. And at Concord, he named it Concord Farm. So that was the original name. And I think they got to know the Nichols family, the George Johnston family, and the boys and so forth. And they were just neighbours and they cooperated. They worked for the Nichols family. Both William Morgan and Thomas Humphreys, Nell's final partner, worked for Isaac Nichols. And Bobby Nichols probably just cared for her as an aunt, nothing more, certainly not romantically. But he was also a person who believed in emancipist rights, in Aboriginal land rights, bizarrely enough, at the time, which was very, very unusual. And I think that he had to come live with him because he felt she needed it, and he had a young daughter, he'd been widowed, and so she had a function, and so she lived with him for a while, perhaps as much as 10 or 12 years.
Claire, you're calling him Bobby, but he was George, wasn't he?
His full name was George Robert Nichols, and he was called Bobby Nichols. He went by Bobby. Yeah. And other derogatory names.
Claire, I just, sorry, was there another question? Okay, so Claire, I can't thank you enough for coming and sharing that story with us today. Those of us who are not descendants of Nell Fraser, but are Concordians, I mean, putting those pieces together for us is just extraordinary. At the City of Canada Bay, as a heritage society, we take very seriously the heritage of the area, and particularly the Urala Estate and Rivendell, which was owned by Isaac Nichols and then Thomas Walker. In fact, one of the members and I are on the Sydney Local Health District Heritage Committee that has some sort of custodian care of that area. So all of our members, I can see all of our members here who do guide. We do tours of the Urala Estate. So if you're back in Sydney on Sunday the 26th of October, we've still got some spots left. We do tours of the Urala Estate twice a year in April and October, and we do tours of Rivendell in July. So there'll be little brochures there. And if you go to our City of Canada Bay Heritage website, there's a QR, there's a link, and you can book in. So you can actually go to the Isaac Nichols estate and walk around. It's just magnificent down there. You would never know you're in Sydney. It's quite magical, which we all think is very special. So, but that was an extraordinary story and put a whole lot of things that I never knew about of the area that I've lived in almost my entire life. So thank you for coming and sharing that story. Thank you for all the family that come. There's a lot of DNA in this room. And if you haven't met each other, we've got a cup of tea afterwards, just in case there's some member of the family you haven't met before. We also have a book on, if you are interested in Isaac Nichols on the Walker Estate, we actually have a book called The Walkers of Urala that Trish can wave her hand here, that Trish Skane wrote about that history of that area. Clare also wrote a book for us on cemeteries of Concord, and we're really happy to have this book to sell, and we look forward to your future books and future visits. So I think that's all I really wanted to say, that we are serving afternoon tea. I've left my name tag at home. Most of our volunteers all got name tags on, so you'll be able to identify them. Claire's here to sign books for you, that you can see Sharon there in the pink and purple top will sell books to you. This volunteer, the City of Canada Bay Heritage Society is a fully volunteer-run organisation. This museum is completely volunteer-run, so feel free to have a wander around and have a look at the museum. We also have a little donation box if you so desire, but feel free to wander around. We're open this afternoon. we're really happy that you came. And thank you so much. And thank you